introduce Mark Hall, who is the president of Atlantic Communities up in Atlanta, Georgia. Mark, do you mind telling us a little bit about your company? I think it's pretty impressive, and I love working with you over the past, I think I met you maybe 7 or 8 years ago now.
Gosh, has it really been that long?
It's been that long.
I have been with what's now Atlanta Communities since 1997. So this is the beginning of my 27th year. In 2009, I was we went independent. We left the RE/MAX system and went independent in 2009. We now have 7 office locations in Metro Atlanta. We are probably number 4 in volume in Metro Atlanta and have over 2,000 realtors and associate brokers at the company. And for whatever reason, they let me lead it, and it's kind of exciting. I just try not to mess it up is what I really try to do.
That's all anyone tries to do in this
right. I'm a baseball guy, so when Leo Mazzoni was the pitching coach for the Atlanta Braves, they asked him, so how do you keep Smoltz, Glavine, and Maddox in tow? And he said, well, I just don't let them, I don't screw them up.
Yeah, so, I don't get in the way. I let them pitch. That's right.
Sure.
Well, and the reason why I wanted to invite you on, I'll introduce everyone else for the uninitiated, but we've got Mike Hughes, managing broker at Downing Fry, vice president, and we've got my dad, Don Ross, who's an attorney with me here at Ross Title and Ross Law. And I thought that this was a neat time. We don't know everything there is to know about how this industry will evolve and how it will change and how it will potentially even get better. But there's a need for discussion. There's a need for collaboration. Dad, you and I talked about it this morning.
David said yes, by the way.
It basically said, you said, we all need to be on the same page to solidify this industry. And, at the end of the day, we've got people that are relying on us. And we've got to find a way to, just kind of see through all the junk, see through all the weeds. And Dad, you mentioned, well, why don't we get some of the brokers together? And I'm like, there's no one better that I could think of than Mark. So Mark, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So Mike, also, thank you for joining us. You've done a lot in the last, since Friday, trying to understand the latest, and you've had some moments where it's like, oh man, this is depressing. In fact, I wrote on the board, I talked to a different broker who said it's just kind of sad at the moment. Like, it's like we gotta pick ourselves up here. And Mike, you talked with me earlier today, and you said, we've got some more information, and there's more that's coming out every day. What was your vibe? You said you sat in on a meeting yesterday at the Miami Board of Realtors.
Correct, and that's the largest board in the country. They had a hired gun, so to speak, from a Washington, D.C. law firm that all he does is antitrust. And he shed a lot of information that I have not heard on the street so far. Obviously, this got dropped in our lap on Friday, and huge overreaction by many. But his very first note was, don't believe everything you're reading in the newspapers, because a lot of the articles are flat out wrong on what's going on. And he gave 1 or 2 examples of that. And he said, we've been busy trying to get the stories corrected. But that's part of the problem, is a lot of our information seems initially to be coming from the newspapers, which I think is problematic. But
fear mongering, you're saying.
Right. And I feel much better about this than I did Friday. Friday, I was ready for happy hour because I needed it. Over the weekend, I took probably several hundred calls. But in talking and getting more info, I do feel better about this. We're going to have to change. That is a given. We're going to change how we do business, but it's very doable, and we're still going to be selling a lot of properties. I am not as rattled or concerned as I was when I first heard this. Why I was rattled Friday was we were under the impression that this was going through appeals and it would be several years before we had some kind of a verdict. And then all of a sudden have this dumped in your lap with no warning.
Right.
To me was a bit astonishing, but let me share with you what I got from the.
Well, Mike, if you give me 1 minute, because
Sure.
I love that you said that. And it's also why Dad is why I have you on here, and Mark, it's why I invited you on here, because everyone on this podcast or video all said the same thing to me independently. They said, it's pretty significant. And we're going to have to get down to the basics. We're going to have to pick ourselves up and we're going to have to prove the value. Mark, you said it more eloquently than these, chumps. But what was your thinking on that? I mean, you said it so eloquently. You said you've been preaching these values that you have to create value for your client. And it's no different now than it was last year.
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day is how can you improve yourself? Because I believe that first person you have to address is the person in the mirror, and you have to figure out, what am I worth? Because value is perceived by the other side. Worth is what you bring and what you think you're worth. And if you believe you're worth something, then you should go and make the list. However that is, it's got to be, it's got to be, specifically to you. And you have to make sure that you articulate that message to the people you want to serve. It's not, I don't know that it's significantly different. I mean, how do you get paid as attorneys? How do we get paid as brokers? How do we do anything where we get paid a fee for whatever it is we do?
Well, you said that to me earlier. You said, I had this conversation with my accountant, they charged me a certain thing, and I trust this person. This is what it is. We've been in this industry where we haven't had to prove our worth potentially. Well, now it's like, now you have to operate like everyone else does. Actually, Mark, I didn't tell you this, or maybe I did. I had an agent, and I don't know if she's on today or not, but she asked me about what we charge, for seller representations or representing a buyer. And she goes, I didn't realize that. I thought the fees were X. And I said, yeah, we raised our fees over the last 2 years, and but that's how we value ourselves. We think that if we're delivering all this service, we deserve to get paid for it. And we're not at the bottom, and we're not at the top. We're valuing ourselves, in a certain way. That's our value proposition, essentially. And you felt like that was what every professional has to do.
Well, if you think about how we ended up here, we have a certain number of people in real estate, at least here in Metro Atlanta, I can't speak for Florida, where it's about the money versus about the service. And I think at some point there was a bigger disconnect between those two. And I think as the pendulum always does, it swung so far the other way. This is the hangover from the post-COVID run-up of value prices and how quickly homes sold, and buyers left out and said, what are you doing for me? You can't seem to help me secure a property. And sellers said, what are you doing for me? All I got to do is put a sign out there in my yard and I get 37 offers. And this is kind of the hangover, and enterprising attorneys, and I know I've got two at least on here.
Don't worry, we don't bite.
I don't want to malign the profession, but enterprising attorneys are then looking at that, and they see this void, and they're thinking, okay, where are we going to get our next revenue, and what's happening? And they said, well, you know what? Now's the time to push forward on the commission lawsuit, because we may gain traction, and the Department of Justice is sitting there ready to go. And they've been ready to go because they haven't liked the real estate industry as long as I've been in it, which is about 30 years. They don't like us. We were very politically connected, and for whatever reason, I guess that political connection has eroded away, because the Department of Justice has been very active against the real estate industry. And now we get the Federal Reserve weighing in and saying these people they earn way too much money and they kept prices. But come on, really?
Yeah,
I
We
know,
don't
yeah.
talk about you that way.
Well, and Dad, I wanted to bring you in on this too, because you've seen this before in our industry. We've seen massive changes and these moments of panic. You told me once that you actually went to get your insurance license because you thought that you would have to get that to sell title insurance. Is that right?
I got my mortgage broker's license because I wanted to know more about the entire process, because we deal with lenders all the time. But the sales license, the broker's license, I got those when I was 18, 19, and I did it again when your brother got his license.
But I think at one point, what was the lawsuit that changed title insurance?
The Butler case.
The Butler case. So
case.
tell me about that case, a little bit perspective for people.
Well, it was filed years ago, questioning whether or not the agent, the title agent could negotiate his portion of the premium with the buyer if the buyer is paying title insurance. And in full disclosure, if there's $1 paid for title insurance, we get 70% of it, and the other 30% goes to the underwriter. So the whole lawsuit was, whether or not the buyer could negotiate part of our 70%. And everybody was losing their minds over this. I mean, everybody. What's this going to do? And it's going to drive down what we can charge for title insurance. It ended up being resolved in favor of the plaintiff. Yes, he can negotiate and get a share of the premium, but we had to prove our value.
We had to prove our
value. This is what we do.
Yeah.
We have overhead. We have employees. We're not necessarily making what you think we're making. So this is our fee. Some people, and myself included, proactively would cut the premium on certain, large deals. And years after that, I stopped doing that and found out nobody even objected. They saw the value. I mean, as my father told me this years ago, we're all in the sales business. We're selling legal services. You got to prove to people that we're worth it. And realtors are in the same boat. They're selling the real estate in themselves.
Yeah, Mike, you said that you had some really interesting, feedback from that meeting yesterday. What can you share with everyone?
Very interesting. In fact, people here, I know you got a bunch of people attending today. You might want to get a pen and a piece of paper out. Here's what I found from this antitrust attorney. First off, I want to reiterate that he pointed out that a lot of the newspaper articles have been wrong. They've had errors through them. But he says, and this is an important point if you represent sellers, he says he doesn't see the home prices falling due to this settlement. They might fall for some other reason, but due to this settlement, he doesn't see home prices.
Well, let me, I think that's a great point. And Mark, you and I spoke about that. And I spoke with an incredible agent yesterday, who I believe is watching. Mark, you mentioned that. You said, I don't know if this is going to change prices at all.
No. Why would it?
The next thing he said was that this settlement offer has not been filed with the court system yet. Now, keep in mind, the court would have to weigh in and approve this settlement, but it has not been filed yet. However, the expectation is it will be filed shortly, probably next week.
Mark, you saw the lawsuit, right? I just got this yesterday. Or did you read the settlement yet?
Yes.
You did read the settlement. You got me beat. Dad, you read this, right?
No, I got it yesterday and it's on my to-do list for today.
Yeah, so there's a lot to still learn. We'll have to see what it says.
It's 108 pages of legalese.
I didn't even know Mark could read, so this is great.
Yeah, I know.
All right, keep going.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I was in the Marines, so yeah, I signed the wrong paper. I was buying a marina.
He then goes on and says the lawsuits will be mostly over due to this settlement. Mostly is a key word. And I'm giving you these notes in no particular order. He said, do not expect much to change until summer. So they got a little bit of time. Down here in Florida, we've got time to deal with seasons, so to speak. But it doesn't hurt. And I know that, a lot of our brokerage firms are starting to prepare for this. because we are going to have to change somewhat. He says likely, very important point here, likely that the courts will approve with probably no modifications to the settlement that's on the table right now. In other words, he said both sides have agreed on the terms. So he doesn't see modifications happening. Is there a chance there could be a modification? Yes. But right now, it doesn't look like there'll be any changes there. He said that in the fourth quarter, if everything flows through, that's when you'll start seeing the cases dismissed. Going a step further, for those that are members of the Miami board, I have where you can get more information. You can contact me after this meeting. No change to clear cooperation. And there's a lot of people that think that all this stems from clear cooperation. And he said, no, no change to clear cooperation. He pointed out, and this is something I would have to verify with another lawyer, that you're not going to be able to have co-bro commission in the MLS, but you can display it on the company website. So I certainly want to get a second legal opinion on that one. Offers of compensation from sellers are still okay. Flipping through my pages here. He recommends that firms have an antitrust policy as part of their policies and procedures. It did say that some forms will change. So I'm assuming he was referring to the buyer-broker agreement, but he said forms, plural. So what forms will be changing, that's to be determined. We'll see.
Great. Great.
He says August 1st is kind of a tentative target date, but he said it could be later. You know, these big deals tend to drag on a bit. So, but you're looking at third quarter. You know, if it goes into the fourth quarter, we'll see.
So Mike, the there's a lot that's still unknown. I wanted to make sure that, Mark, I gave you a little bit of a platform, a little spotlight here, because I think what you said to me earlier was really key in providing value and being as the greatest version of yourself. You mentioned this and we talked on it briefly, but how do you rally the troops? How do you rally yourself? How do you kind of adjust to this? Because that's what it is. It's an adjustment. We're going to find how to sell. We're going to find our way and what services we use to do it. How do you rally the troops in that regard?
Well, that's yet to be determined, but in theory, for me, it's very easy. And I'll go back to Marine Corps training and say that if you have to face an enemy, you can't predict what they will do. You have to rely on how well you trained. And in this case, this is no different than that. The better training you have and the better prepared, because they don't know what they don't know, and you don't know what they don't know, which means that for like so much stuff that I talk about frequently, it's all about conversations. And you have to be well-versed enough to be able to have conversations with buyers and conversations with sellers. And you have to be confident in what you bring to the table to be able to have those conversations. And it really is as conversational as I'm talking about it right now, because I could tell if I was in front of a buyer, I'd say, well, I normally charge 10%. And I'd just sit there and they'd go, really, 10%? I thought it was 6%. That's what I heard on the news. And okay, well, let's do it for 5%. In other words, right. I mean, you've got to figure out how to make it work for you. That's first and foremost, is how do you want to present the information to buyers and sellers, and how committed you are to serving them and to having them as your client. because a lot of times maybe you don't.
Yeah, exactly. So
You
I
might
want to
wanna-
run down a couple of questions here that I had that I was going over this with an agent yesterday that I respect, and right off the top of her head, here were some of the things she was thinking. Number one is timing. Mike, you touched on timing briefly. You're going to see things in the news. You're going to hear things that maybe, you know, oh, so-and-so is doing it next week. So-and-so is doing it next month. I don't see that. I see this, they're going to take the full time, if not as much, you know, more they can. I just, we have to kind of let things happen, but the training starts as soon as possible. Someone just texted me. Training starts now, kind of preparing yourself, putting together a strategy. Like you said, Mark, training, like preparation is key. You can't predict what 6 months from now is going to look like. The other thing was agency changes. Eileen even mentioned this in the chat feature. Do we predict that you might see more single agency here in Florida? So Mark, you know, by default here in Florida, we're transaction agents, but you can elect to be a single agent for the buyer or for the seller. And you can't have dual agency, which I think is the same in Georgia. But it's by default your transaction that might change, and that's okay. That's not the worst thing in the world. We're gonna represent our clients now if that is the case. That'll be okay. I'm not so worried about that part. Let's see. iBuyers. Mark, this is another reason why I wanted to have you on here. When we were in Atlanta, when I was in Atlanta, it was like every month there was a new iBuyer out there. You know, Zillow was huge at one point, going out there buying stuff. Oh, he's on mute, so hopefully he'll come back to me. So Zillow was out there. They were buying stuff. You had Knock, you have Open Door, you have any other number of companies that would be created out of this mindset. And what did we, I mean, what I learned from all those in Atlanta was you still have to be good. You can have the greatest technology in the world. You can offer an online platform that buyers can log in. But if you can't find them a house, then whatever savings you're generating are useless. You know, and Atlanta is more indicative of that than our market down here in South Florida. We don't see many of those. What is your experience on these iBuyers and how it's worked or not worked in the past?
Well, it hasn't worked as well as they wanted it to, and partly because they don't have the human part of what they need to make it work. And that's where, again, for me, the transition from where we are now to where we may be going is the same transition that we would have made already from where we are now to where we might be going, which is you gotta double down on what you bring to the table. And the one thing that you bring above all else is your humanness. There's a whole group of people out there that don't want any human interaction about anything with anybody at any time. So guess what? Don't do business with those people because they don't care about us.
Yep.
And then there's the other 80% of the people out there in the marketplace that want to do business with me and with you specifically because it's me and it's you, and they want our expertise and they want our knowledge and they want everything about it. And that's the people you need to seek out.
That's the
And
people you seek out.
The iBuyer crowd lost because they thought that they could run an algorithm and tell the difference between house A and house B. And then they got stuck because they overpaid for all this other stuff. And then they also, quite frankly, got a backlash from the public and from the market because they bought crappy houses at the most expensive price and wanted to sell crappy houses to consumers, which is the further part of where we are now. That, okay, I'm a crazy nut job. Sorry you got me on here, but
Keep going, Mark. Keep going.
There's elements in the real estate industry that want to be able to have corporate entities sell directly to the public without representation. And doesn't this, in principle at least, further that along? And the answer for me is yes, it does.
So I made when I was a developer, we built subdivisions, and this was before I knew you, Mark. And I remember one of the first properties I ever put together. We're sitting at the table. We had just gotten off the phone with the hedge fund that was funding the whole thing. And someone says, well, what about the wetlands permit? And I looked at them and said, what wetlands? What are you talking about? And they said, oh, you haven't even been to the property. You got no clue what you're doing. That's what he told me. You've got no clue. That was what the iBuyers messed up on, is that they didn't go to the property. They couldn't give that context. And real estate's all about that. And it's about the service. It's about listening to the client, not giving them the algorithm, for sure. It's the simple
one
stuff.
spot on there's the uniqueness of one property. There's one spot on the earth that is exactly that property. And none of the rest of them are the same, much like people. They're all different and they're all unique and they all have their pluses and their minuses everywhere.
So the
Nationally.
other someone mentioned in the chat feature, they said, I just got off another webinar and they said the sky is falling. And actually I was talking to someone else earlier and they said, just remember, they didn't take commissions off the table here. Commissions can still be co-broke, they can still be shared, you can still negotiate with your client on what your value is. And that's what you should do. You should prepare for your value, deliver for your clients, and we can't assume that it's going to be done. You know, it's no different than my business. You value yourself and you're going to run people away, but everyone else is going to be happy to hire you. They're going to be excited and they're going to trust you. And those are the ones that you have to hold on to, like you said, Mark. Mike, what else? Any other words of wisdom for us? You know, obviously there's more to come on this, but we need to know what's next.
Couple things, and this is something that your viewers might want to write down. FloridaRealtors.org, FloridaRealtors.org. If you go to their news feed and scroll back to February 22nd, there's an article, and I've got it right here. It says 18 ways to show buyers you're worth every dollar. Great resource, because honestly, when you start using these buyer broker agreements, if you haven't used them before, your tendency is going to be a little be a little nervous, a little on the defensive. The reality is you're worth every dollar. And so if you go to FloridaRealtors.org and go back to February 22nd, look for that article. That should really help you. The other key point, Christian, we don't know what date all this is going to kick in, but let's pick a date. Let's say August 1st.
Mm-hmm.
You might not want to wait to August 1st. You might actually want to get a little bit of a jump on this and start using these buyer broker agreements, getting familiar with it, because it's going to be the way it is. Now, part of the dilemma for brokers, and I see Jillian is on this call, part of the dilemma is we're being told that these forms will change. So we start training them on the existing forms, and all of a sudden you get new forms that come out that supersede what we're training them on. So we're going to have to kind of work our way through the minefield, so to speak. But I really feel that realtors have been bad over the years selling their value. This is a golden opportunity for us to shine. So I was worried Friday. I don't have those same kind of fears now. I mean, I see a lot of this as being a good thing. We're just going to have to be willing to change a little bit. But the buyers,
I think it's an opportunity, like you said, Mike. I mean, it gives us all a chance to start practicing with these forms. What's the best way to present it? What are the attributes we're going to, show to our clients? What exactly is involved in the real estate closing process? I mean, I see it with members of my own family who, highly educated. They don't know how much work's involved in the real estate closing process. No clue. So why not start practicing now? You get a new skill set. I mean, no matter what happens with this, if you get a new skill set, you're going to be a better realtor.
Yeah, one of the first things I did was when I came down and took over the title company is we drafted our value proposition. And this is something I was taught up in Atlanta when I was working at Campbell and Brannan. is you have to value yourself, and you got to write it down, and then you got to add to it every year, every month, every 6 months, add to it, because that's how people are evaluating it. But you've got to think about it first, and you're forming your pitch, you're forming your marketing plan. I don't know if you guys have ever watched what is it? I'm trying to think. It's like Undercover Millionaire or Undercover Billionaire, maybe. And they had Grant Cardone, who's a very polarizing real estate guy. He's a billionaire who sells, apartments. And they give him nothing. They give him like $100 in a car, and he has to go create $1 million company. And one thing I pulled from that was he had to formulate his pitch because he was creating something from scratch. He couldn't use his name. He couldn't go back to his old cronies. He was in the middle of nowhere and had to start from scratch. And he spent the first month or two just, what do I say when someone asks who I am? What do I say? And that's your value proposition. I thought that was really telling to me. Another question someone had to me was, when do I have a buyer brokerage agreement signed? That's a business decision. I would say in the very least, you're going to need it before you make an offer. But we'll see how this settlement plays out. We'll see if we need to do it sooner. Your company policies might require it sooner. But in the very least, when you make your offer, you'll have that buyer brokerage agreement signed, and that'll be kind of part of the offer. And everyone's going to have to do it. So it's not going to be like, oh, I won't sign it, and be like, well, then you can't work with the realtor.
Yeah, and don't wait till the last minute to start trying the best time. I mean, experiment. Why not?
So, and then another thing I wanted to talk about was there's a thing that I use in addition to formulating my pitch and how I want to present myself. I also need to do that when facing an issue. And I had something called the 1-3-1, and I didn't make it up. I read about it online. It says you figure out what your issue is. That's the 1. You come up with 3 strategies and then 1 suggestion of those 3 strategies. So it's like, all right, here are 3 things that could happen. Here are 3 options for us. We do this, we do that, or we do the other thing, or we do nothing, basically. But here's what I recommend. And if it doesn't work, you pull back, you reevaluate the 3 strategies, and you choose a different one, or you do that. And it goes to what Mark said, we have to be willing to have the conversation. We prepare, and then we execute, we see what comes back, and we adjust. So that's how we deal with title issues. It's how we deal with negotiations. It's no different than our business. We're going to treat our business like a business. Last thing, I know some people have raised their hand, and I'm not going to be able to get to you, unfortunately, but the 2 of you, Mike and Mark, and then Jillian, we mentioned you. She's a president at Premier Plus down here in Florida. You are all 100% companies, and you might have a leg up on the competition. And you didn't ask me to say this, but the reality is you're probably going to have to be skinny, right? You're going to have to keep your expenses down without sacrificing your training and your marketing and all of those things. You're going to want to make yourself as strong as possible. And it's not that you have to be in a 100% company, but you got to have to look at everything. And I think that your business model has always been that, you guys, but it maybe is more relevant than ever. Mark, do you have an opinion on that without doing a salesmanship thing?
Yeah, but I mean, I think it makes companies like ours more flexible and more nimble because we make the decisions. Like I have made probably more presidential executive decisions since Friday of last week than I may have made at any other time in my career, because the information flowing in has made the population that we serve, our realtors and associate brokers, more nervous. And so we need to get to them quicker. You know this because I mentioned it to you this morning. I'm doing a webinar Friday for our company where we're going to talk about the whole settlement, et cetera. And it's the same thing I've been preaching for months and months and months. It's about conversations, and we need to get back to where we're face to face with people, because when we're doing that, we have the ability to explain things and say, when they ask you a question you don't know, you go, I don't know. In other words, you've got to be willing to have empathy, but you've also got to show the vulnerability of what you don't know. And you have to be confident that by sharing what you don't know and being that vulnerable, that it's okay because they don't know either,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Mark, I'll leave you on this. He told me, he said, Christian, if you come up next to me at a stoplight and I'm doing this and I'm playing like I'm doing this, it's because I'm doing air guitar, not because I'm crazy. I'm just listening to music. So I'll leave you on that, Mark. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for your
Well,
insight.
I appreciate it. Thank you for playing to my ego and that I claim I don't have and inviting me to be here. But seriously, I would say to everybody that's on the call, I stopped watching mainstream media. I was a talk radio junkie 7 years ago, and it's the best thing I ever did because I get to formulate my own opinions and not have others formulate them for me.
You're not putting your head in the sand. You're planning, you're prioritizing, and you're figuring out your move.
Right.
Christian, I don't look at this as, I look at this entirely different. I see this as opportunity. I mean,
Yes.
there's
Me
gonna be
too.
a lot of people that aren't going to be sure how to handle whatever. Anytime there's change, I look at opportunity. So, we will continue to change and evolve as an industry over the years. And right now we're dealing with this settlement, potential settlement, but in the future, there'll be other changes. And that's part of life. We just have to adapt and take and move forward. And so I'm looking forward to it. I see it as opportunity.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it, and thanks for joining. We'll do this as we learn more information. But thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.
Christian.